Hello, everyone, and welcome to Zone 7 Gardening Plant Clinic. Today's presentation is celebrating ferns, so I want to welcome everyone. We'll be talking about 4 ferns, which are non-flowering plants, a category of plants suitable for shady locations in your garden. These Zone 7 virtual plant clinics highlight native and other plants suited to grow well in our Mid-Atlantic U.S. hardiness Zone 7 gardens. This is a series of plant clinics sponsored by the Virginia Cooperative Extension program of Virginia's 2 land-grant universities, Virginia Tech and Virginia State University. Fairfax County Master Gardeners staff our plant clinics. Master Gardeners share science-based information about gardening and horticulture topics in this forum, and also in person around the county of Fairfax here in Northern Virginia. Now we're going to continue with non-flowering plants, focusing on our central topic today, ferns, the cinnamon fern and the maiden hair fern, which will be presented by Jenny.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. And hello, my name is Jenny, and my 2 fern topics for today's Zone 7 gardening are the cinnamon fern and the maiden hair fern. What distinguishes ferns from other plants is that they do not have flowers that produce seeds as part of their life cycle. Ferns are seedless vascular plants and the second most diverse group of plants after seed plants. Of the 10,500 living species of ferns today, only about 380 grow in North America. And ferns are the ideal landscaping solutions for shady sites, as most can grow in conditions from deep to partial shade. And their shapes and their textures lend a beautiful, delicate, airy quality to the shade garden. Ferns prefer moist, well-drained soil, high in organic matter, and in a pH range of 4 to 7. So a slightly acidic soil, or more acidic, as the case may be. And during the growing season, they need about an inch of rain or an inch of water per week, which includes water from rain. And if you have a heavy clay soil or sandy soil, you'll want to mix about 2 inches of organic material into the top 10 inches of your soil to improve drainage in the case of clay soils and to help retain moisture in the case of sandy soils. And it's also good to prepare a larger area than just your planting hole, because this helps prevent water from pooling in the planting hole, which would encourage root rot. And once established, ferns are relatively low maintenance, and they have very few issues with diseases or pests, including deer. And so this is one of the few plants that you can really call deer resistant. Since ferns are a woodland plant, mulch is its best friend. A 2 to 3 inch layer of leaves or pine straws applied during the spring and fall is good not only for their nutrients, but for moisture retention. And as mentioned, ferns are hardy in zones 3 to 8. So the cinnamon fern is hardy to zone 9. And since Fairfax is in 7A, it shouldn't be difficult to grow ferns here. In this slide, I talk about reproduction, and ferns reproduce sexually through tiny spores they produce. The arrangement of spores, such as the fertile spikes with the spores on the left, or the packets of spores on the undersides, the leaves on the right, help to identify the plant. The fertile fronds on the left belong to the cinnamon fern. They're upright and appear in the spring, first as bright green wands, and then they quickly ripen into that lovely chocolate or cinnamon brown. The other species have brown or yellowish clusters of spore-producing structures called sporangia, located on the undersurface of the fronds. The maidenhair sporangia on the right are light brown and elongated on the edge of each fan-shaped frond and are covered by a flap. Some ferns have rusty-looking clusters of sporangia that novices sometimes mistake as a pest problem. And there are 2 stages in the fern life cycle. The first is when the spore germinates into a small, heart-shaped, leaf-like structure called a prothállium. Prothállium contains both the male and female reproductive organs, and this is the haploid stage. And if you recall your high school biology, these organs contain half the genetic material needed. And in the presence of water, the sperm from the male part of the plant swims through to the egg and fertilizes it. The fertilized egg forms the zygote, which is the diploid stage of the plant cycle. And the zygote absorbs water and nutrients through the vascular tissue and then grows into a mature fern, which produces more spores. In some ferns, it can take as long as 6 months for the first fronds to appear after fertilization. And next, I'll go into the specifics of each fern. The cinnamon fern, or the Osmundum cinnamomum, is a native deciduous perennial. The fiddleheads emerge in the early spring, and they come from the base of the plant and are covered with the downy wool that you see on the left there. They unfurl into large yellowish green fronds that are pinnately compound. These fronds are sterile, and they grow 2 to 4 feet long and tend to arch outward. The separate spore-bearing fronds that you saw in the previous slide are the first to appear and grow from the center. They're bright green wands that quickly turn brown, and the spores are dispersed in the summer, and the spikes wither by late summer. In some species, this fern, these spikes can last through the winter to provide interest in the landscape. The common name of this plant is in reference to the cinnamon-colored fibers found at the base of the fronds, and these fronds remain attractive throughout the summer and turn yellow in the autumn. The cinnamon fern grows in moist, boggy ground along streams and shaded ledges and bluffs, so it's great for areas in the landscape that are wet or that are in partial to full shade. They're slow to establish, but they are long-lived. And while it prefers humusy and slightly acidic soils, it can adapt to lesser conditions, but it may go dormant in dry soil. They typically grow in vase-shaped clumps between 2 and 4 feet wide and 2 and 6 feet tall. It has a massive, dense rootstock with wiry roots and horizontal rhizomes that can be vigorous. And you could propagate this fern by cutting a section of the rhizome that has at least one frond and a growing tip. Put the cutting in a pot or on the surface of moist soil and keep it moist and shaded for best results. Sterile fronds typically turn yellow in the fall, but in this photo, you can see that it's a gorgeous orange red. So, it can be very attractive in the fall. Next is the northern Maidenhead fern, which is pronounced Adiantum pedatum as their Latin name. And this is a very attractive and airy fern recognized by the dark and slender vertical stalks called stipes and the horizontal branches called rachis. The stipes are very erect, about 14 to 20 inches tall, and the rachis are held somewhat horizontally. So this delicate fern looks like it's floating in midair. The rachis divides into 2 to form a horseshoe shape. So you kind of see that in the photo of the full leaf. And they bear long feather-like leaf branches or pinnae. And there are 3 to 8 for each fork of the rachis. And the shallowly scalped lobes on the leaves fold under to protect the spore cases. And the spores are released during the summer and fall and distributed by the wind. A really unique thing about the leaves is that their surface is so smooth that water doesn't cling to it. So it always looks perfectly dry. Even if you take a frond and dunk it under the water and pull it up, it's dry. The genus name Adiatum is derived from the Greek word adiantos, meaning unwetted. In the next photo, the fiddleheads are shown emerging in the early spring, where they are wine red, very delicate looking, and covered by wiry hairs. Both the stipes and the rachis will turn purple-brown to black at maturity. Maidenhair are a deciduous clump-forming native fern, typically 1 to 2 feet tall and just as wide. And they prefer partial to full shade and humus-rich soil that is neutral to slightly alkaline. So they prefer a pH of 7 or 8. The maidenhair spreads by creeping branching rhizomes to form large colonies. So you can see that happening here. And you do need some patience as this fern spreads slowly. When you can no longer see the individual fronds in the clump, you can divide it in the spring, cutting through the rhizome and replanting where it can be kept moist. And this fern doesn't tolerate drying out, so summer heat will cause the fronds to turn brown, especially if the soil is dry or it gets too much sun. Like other ferns, the maidenhair has no serious insect or disease problems and is seldom damaged by deer. They're beautiful, used as an edging along the shady path, as specimen plants, or simply let naturalize. And for a companion plant, these finely textured ferns contrast nicely with plants that have larger leaves like hostas or caladium, have shiny leaves like hellebores, or plants with other colors and textures like heuchera and brunea. So the interesting thing about ferns is they do have other uses. The cinnamon fern has several wildlife and as well as medicinal uses. The osmundifer from the base of the spore fronds is used for potting orchids. The downy wool from the fiddleheads has reportedly been used as nest lining by yellow warblers, hummingbirds, and other songbirds. And birds like the Kentucky warbler, the brown thrasher, and veeries nest in the center part of the fern's clump. And when they grow in large colonies, these ferns provide cover for wildlife from predators. A number of Native American tribes use a root decoction, which is where they boil the roots and concentrate the liquid to treat rheumatism by rubbing it into the aching joints. And they also used it to remedy chills, headache, joint pain, and colds. And while it used to be used as a full food source, all parts of the plant, including the fiddleheads, are now thought to be carcinogenic. So beware. The ostrich fern, which Kathleen will cover in her talk, are the only fiddleheads considered edible. And the maidenhair fern, I couldn't find too many references for use by wildlife. So they do get used by toads and lizards as shelter, and a few birds use the fronds as nesting material. But it did have quite a few medicinal uses. Its known medicinal properties are as an expectorant, an anti-rheumatic, and a demulcent, which is a compound that protects the mucus linings. So pectin, glycerin, and honey are other examples of demulcent compounds. And these are common ingredients in cough mixtures and cough drops. Because of its medicinal properties, the maidenhair was highly valued as a medicinal plant by some 19th century, probably non-Native American practitioners, just by the descriptions that I've read. And so they used the fern in the form of a tea or syrup to treat nasal congestion, asthma, and sore throat. Native Americans had several medicinal uses. They used a root decoction for rheumatism, a whole plant decoction as an emetic in the cases of fever, or an infusion of dried fronds as a remedy for shortness of breath. They also smoked the dried powdered leaves for heart trouble and asthma, and used a poultice of wet smashed fronds to treat snake bites. So they had quite a few uses for the maidenhair. Now, I've always loved ferns, but my appreciation has grown since seeing the number of medicinal uses in particular, and by their use by birds, which I never expected. So the final slide is a listing of my references. And I particularly enjoyed finding the Adirondacks Forever Wild website and the Medicinal Herb website, because these are both new to me. And they have the .org web address, which is what we look for, but they weren't in our normal university plant and other wildlife websites. So back to you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Jenny. That was a fantastic talk about both of those ferns. Next, we're ready to learn about the Christmas fern and the ostrich fern that Kathy or Kathleen is going to be talking about. Welcome to the program, Kathy.
Thank you. I'll talk about the Christmas fern and the ostrich fern, and while they share many characteristics of ferns, these two do have their differences. So first, let's look at the Christmas fern, Polystichum acrostichoides. Why is it called a Christmas fern? There are several legends, but a prevalent idea is that the fern is still green at Christmas and through the winter, and has been used for holiday decorations for generations. This native perennial has medium or dark green fronds that are slightly shiny. It stays green until the new fiddleheads pop up in the early spring. So the fern will be visible in the landscape in winter, through winter, unless we've had a snowfall that flattens the fronds. The fronds are lance-shaped and dimorphic, meaning there are two types, fertile and non-fertile. The fertile fronds are taller and will die off. The sterile fronds are smaller and will remain evergreen. It grows up to about 1.5 feet tall, and it's very suitable for woodland gardens, shady borders, and wild or native gardens. The foliage and the fountain-like form make this an attractive part of your landscape. They will grow where it might be difficult to succeed with other types of plants. This fern likes part shade to full shade. It likes well-drained soil with moderate moisture and areas where it can wick up moisture from the lower ground, so a slope is suitable. And it does like soil with a pH that is neutral to acid. This is a low maintenance and generally trouble-free plant. Some gardeners trim the previous year's foliage when the new fiddleheads appear in the spring, but some say it's not necessary to do that. It's easy to cultivate. The rhizome can be dug up and divided to create more plants. On its own, it's a slow grower that will expand slightly from year to year, growing from a clump which will expand over time. Also, spores form in late summer, and they are released from the fertile fronds. This is good for massing on slopes to stabilize the soil and help prevent erosion. The prostrate fronds hold fallen leaves against the ground, and that speeds up the decomposition of those leaves and then leads to enriching of the soil. The fern provides winter cover near the ground for songbirds who may use the tough hairs to build their nests and create shelters. As we've heard, deer and rabbits generally stay away from ferns, but there are references that with overpopulated herds of deer, they may graze on Christmas ferns where other food may be scarce. The Christmas fern might develop crown rot in poorly drained soils, especially in winter. It also may have a fern scale insect and a mealybug that can feed on the plants and do some damage. Also, the larvae of the pyralid moth may build a structure within the sterile fronds where they will feed. The Christmas fern does pair well with a wide range of shade-loving plants, and one in particular that may be useful in your landscape is the heuchera, which has a more rounded form, and they have a good contrast. So now let's talk about the ostrich fern. Matutia Stretharopterus. You may also see that referred to as Onoclea Stretharopterus. The name comes from the Greek word strathio, meaning ostrich, and pteris, meaning fern. This one is different from a Christmas fern. It's big, it's deciduous, it spreads, it likes swampy spots. This native is a tall, graceful fern with visible spores in midsummer. The fronds are long and lance-shaped. They grow from clumps and they look like ostrich feathers when they grow taller and then start to gracefully bend, creating a really beautiful, almost a grove of what looks like ostrich feathers. The fronds remain visible through the winter, although they do die back somewhat. You've heard of fiddleheads that you can eat, and as Jenny mentioned, this is one of the ferns that produces those edible fiddleheads. These grow large, up to 3 feet in cultivation typically, but in the wild they can get even larger, up to about 5 feet, and nearly as wide, generally up to 4 feet wide. The fern does very well in shady woodland, wild gardens, and wet areas near streams and ponds. This is a tough plant and it's aggressive, so make sure you have space for it to spread or share it with neighbors who want to start their own bank of ferns. The vegetative fronds without spores are beautiful, but they may look a bit tattered in late summer. So the shorter fertile fronds with spores arise in midsummer and they stay brownish. Because of this late season look, you may want to combine the ostrich fern with other shade-loving plants in the landscape. And there are many options for those. Some of them may be astilbes, hostas, and early spring wildflowers such as trilliums and Virginia bluebells. It prefers moist shade to part shade areas, of course, and it may tend to burn in sun and wind and in very dry soils. So it likes to keep moist, and the soil it prefers is neutral to acidic. The ostrich fern spreads underground and, as I said, aggressively with rhizomes forming sizable colonies. It also spreads through spores in the fertile fronds. And these may pop up unexpectedly with new plants growing several feet from the nearest established clump. So the gardener has the opportunity then to transplant these volunteers to areas where they may want to fill in the landscape. This fern is resistant to deer and rabbits. And this native fern may have a borer moth that has caterpillars that bore into the fronds through the rhizome. But other than that, there are few diseases or pests to deal with the ostrich fern. Here are some resources. And I'll note an excellent article on the Fairfax Master Gardeners website, fairfaxgardening.org, Carefree Ferns for Your Landscape. This is a very good overview for the gardener by one of our members.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Wanted to say that I gave away about 200 ostrich ferns this spring. It was literally just the side of our house. The way the sun goes over my house, the side of my house is very shady. And I had planted a single ostrich fern on the side of the house about 20 years ago. And they are aggressive spreaders. In 20 years, I had about 200 in that spot. So this year, they were growing underneath some rhododendron shrubs that were also getting old and were dying. And so we replanted that entire area. So I was digging up ostrich ferns right and left, and I did give them to neighbors and friends. So, and I've done that in the past, and I still have probably a couple dozen on my property. Today, we're going to talk just a little bit about some gardener's tips. And I selected some of these because I've been dealing with Japanese beetles. They are out there and feeding. And I have learned, just as it suggests here, you can brush them off into a bucket of soapy water, and that will take care of them. That kills them. It's been determined that using Japanese beetle traps near your plants is not actually recommended, because studies have shown that the traps actually attract more beetles to your landscape, resulting in increased damage. And the damage they do is basically eating leaves and foliage. Another topic here is mulch in your landscape. It's a very good idea to use mulch here in Virginia, and it's good to apply it now if you haven't already done so this season, because the mulch does help keep down weeds and it helps conserve soil moisture, which is going to be especially important if you're growing ferns, because ferns overall love moisture. The moisture should be applied 1 to 2 inches deep, and you do want to pull it away from the trunks of shrubs and trees, because I believe it encourages insects and it can cause rot at the base of the trunks. There's many ways to weed. I have a tendency to weed by hand, and I pull out the weeds when I see them. That's the best time I've discovered, because if you leave them there, they're just going to get bigger. It's also easier to pull weeds when there's been a recent rain. And it might seem counterintuitive, but if you're planning to weed your garden and it's been dry, water it first, and then it will be easier to pull those weeds by hand. It's also a good idea to wear gloves when you're weeding by hand, because especially if there's a lot of foliage and you can't see exactly where you're putting your hand, you might unexpectedly encounter a poisonous insect or poisonous foliage. So it's a good idea to wear gloves when you're weeding by hand. I was weeding by hand without gloves once and encountered a caterpillar, and I'm not certain of the botanical name, but I recall that it was called saddleback was in the name, and it gave me a good sting. So I do recommend gloves when you're weeding by hand. And lawn mowing is important, especially this time of year, especially when we have lots of rain and it's growing fast. One thing to encourage your mowing, mow them high and let them lie. I like this expression. I got this from the University of Maryland Extension Service. That's a good mowing strategy, especially when the heat is here. You want to cut your lawn so it's at 3 to 4 inches. In other words, don't cut it too short, is what they're explaining with mow them high. And let it lie is the idea of allowing your clippings to fall on the lawn, because they actually will give nutrients to the soil eventually, let them naturally decompose. If you're growing chrysanthemums and asters expecting fall blooms, you actually need to trim them back right about now, because they will start blooming now. And I actually have this happening, and I've decided I'm going to leave it and let the chrysanthemum bloom now. But if you're waiting and want those to be blooming in the fall, you do need to trim them back at this point. And another tip for July, the hot July sun quickly heats up the water sitting in your hose if it's in the sun. So run the hose until the water is tepid before watering the garden. I've gone out, turned on the hose, and discovered it feels like bath water. It's really pretty hot if it's been sitting in the sun for a while. So you do want to let it run a bit for the health of your plants. A vegetable garden needs at least 1 inch of water per week in the summer. And that's a good rule of thumb, that most gardens, whether ornamental or you're growing them for food, need 1 inch of water each week. And we tend to get that in Virginia, but we also do have dry periods. Check out the Fairfax County Master Gardeners website. Right here, we have circled the web address. Search for monthly gardening articles and advice at this website. You can actually subscribe by email to receive notices when the site is updated. And Fairfax County Gardeners also have an Instagram account. We also provide plant clinics virtually, like in this setting, and in person, typically at local farmers markets and local libraries. We also have a help desk, which you can email or call, and many more exciting things going on. If you're interested in learning more about growing plants in Fairfax County, we've actually been doing these virtual plant clinics for about 2 years, since 2020, and many of them are recorded. You'll find past presentations from the Fairfax County Master Gardeners on our own YouTube channel. Look for VCE Fairfax County YouTube. Please consider attending another Wednesday noon hour program on Zone 7 gardening. Happy gardening, everyone.